May 29th, 1944. Pas-de-Calais, France. 3:47 a.m. Oberst Georg von Frundsberg stood in the concrete bunker overlooking the English Channel, his binoculars trained on the dark waters below. The veteran commander of the 15th Army's coastal defenses had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. Behind him, 250,000 German troops waited in carefully prepared positions. Before him, the narrowest point of the channel stretched just 21 miles to the white cliffs of Dover, clearly visible on clear days. He had no doubt the invasion would come here. Every piece of intelligence confirmed it. The Allies were assembling the largest invasion force in history directly across from Calais. Reconnaissance flights showed massive troop concentrations in southeastern England. Radio intercepts revealed the 1st U.S. Army Group, commanded by General George Patton himself, positioned for the obvious crossing point. The logic was inescapable. Calais offered the shortest route, the best ports, and the straightest path to the Ruhr industrial heartland. What von Frundsberg couldn't know, what no German commander suspected, was that he was staring at the most elaborate deception in military history. Every troop concentration, every radio message, every piece of intelligence his command had gathered was a carefully orchestrated lie. The real invasion fleet was assembling 200 miles to the southwest. The 1st U.S. Army Group didn't exist, and George Patton was commanding an army of ghosts. The operation was called Fortitude. Before it ended, it would cause Hitler to waste his best divisions guarding empty beaches while the real battle raged elsewhere. It would keep 19 German divisions frozen in place for 7 critical weeks after D-Day, and it would demonstrate that in modern warfare, perception could be more powerful than 100 panzer divisions. The deception had begun 18 months earlier, in December 1942, when a small group of British intelligence officers gathered in a nondescript London office to discuss an impossible problem. Any invasion of France would require an overwhelming force at the point of attack, but concentrating that force would be obvious to German reconnaissance. The solution, proposed by Colonel John Bevan of the London Controlling Section, was audacious. Make the Germans see what they expected to see, then attack where they weren't looking. The plan that emerged was breathtaking in scope. It would require creating fictional armies, complete with fake radio traffic, dummy equipment, and false intelligence reports. It would demand the cooperation of every Allied intelligence service, and it would need to maintain perfect consistency across thousands of individual deceptions, any one of which could unravel the entire operation. Lieutenant Colonel David Strangeways, the brilliant and eccentric chief of deception for 21st Army Group, took Bevan's concept and expanded it into a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Strangeways understood that successful deception required more than just feeding the enemy false information. It required understanding how the enemy's intelligence system worked, what they expected to find, and how to make fiction more convincing than reality. The foundation of Fortitude was built on a simple principle: give the Germans information they wanted to believe. German intelligence had concluded, correctly, that any invasion of France must capture a major port quickly to sustain the attacking force. Cherbourg, at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy, was the only significant port on the invasion coast. Therefore, the Germans reasoned the Allies must attack elsewhere and capture the massive port facilities at Calais or Le Havre. The British would spend 18 months reinforcing this assumption with carefully constructed evidence. The deception split into 2 parallel operations. Fortitude North would threaten an invasion of Norway, forcing Hitler to maintain 13 divisions in Scandinavia. Fortitude South would create a phantom invasion force in southeastern England, aimed at Calais, causing the Germans to concentrate their strongest units at the wrong location. The Norway deception began in February 1944. British intelligence created the fictional Fourth Army, supposedly consisting of 250,000 troops training in Scotland for Arctic warfare. Radio operators transmitted thousands of messages using the radio protocols of real British units. The messages discussed cold weather training, ski instruction, and amphibious exercises. To make the deception convincing, the British recruited Norwegian resistance fighters to sabotage German installations in ways that suggested preparation for invasion. Swedish diplomats, known to have contacts with German intelligence, were fed false information about British military movements in Scotland. Double agents confirmed the Fourth Army's existence with detailed reports of unit locations and training activities. The physical evidence was equally elaborate. In Scottish ports, workers constructed dummy landing craft from canvas and wood. These inflatable vessels, created by a team of stage designers and engineers, looked identical to real landing craft from the air. German reconnaissance flights photographed vast fleets of invasion vessels that would dissolve in a rainstorm. Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, received regular intelligence summaries about British preparations for a Norwegian invasion. Each report added details to the fictional threat. By April 1944, German intelligence assessed the Fourth Army at full strength and ready for operations. Hitler, haunted by Norway's strategic importance and fearful of losing Swedish iron ore supplies, refused to withdraw the 13 divisions stationed there. These 220,000 German troops would remain in Norway throughout D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The men and equipment represented more combat power than the entire German force initially defending the Normandy beaches. They were the first victims of British deception. But Fortitude North was merely the supporting act. The main deception, Fortitude South, would create an invasion threat so convincing that German commanders would question the reality of the actual Normandy landings even as they happened. The centerpiece of Fortitude South was the 1st United States Army Group, known as FUSOG. On paper, FUSOG consisted of 11 divisions totaling 150,000 men, commanded by America's most famous general, George S. Patton. In reality, FUSOG existed only in radio transmissions, intelligence reports, and the fevered calculations of German staff officers. Creating a phantom army required extraordinary attention to detail. Every real army generated thousands of radio messages daily as units coordinated movements, requested supplies, and reported status. FUSOG's radio operators transmitted a similar volume of traffic carefully scripted to suggest the activities of combat divisions preparing for invasion. The radio deception was managed by specialists who understood military communications at an intimate level. Messages discussed fuel allocations for tank units that didn't exist. Supply officers requested winter clothing for divisions that consisted of 2 radio operators in a tent. Medical units reported readiness to handle casualties from phantom regiments. Each transmission was carefully calibrated to match the communications patterns of real American units. The physical deception was equally elaborate. In fields across southeastern England, construction crews erected vast dummy installations. Inflatable Sherman tanks, costing $150 compared to $45,000 for real tanks, filled staging areas near Dover and Folkestone. Rubber landing craft crowded harbors. Canvas supply dumps stretched across the countryside. From reconnaissance altitude, these installations were indistinguishable from genuine preparations. The attention to detail was obsessive. Dummy tanks were positioned in groups matching real armored formations. Inflatable vehicles were moved periodically to suggest ongoing training. Workers created false vehicle tracks around the installations. In some locations, soldiers actually lived in the camps to create authentic patterns of activity. Lieutenant Colonel Clifton James, a British Army officer who bore a striking resemblance to General Bernard Montgomery, was recruited for perhaps the most audacious element of the deception. After studying Montgomery's mannerisms and habits, James impersonated the general on a highly publicized visit to Gibraltar and North Africa in May 1944. German intelligence, tracking Montgomery's movements obsessively, concluded that the invasion couldn't happen without Britain's most famous general present to command it. Meanwhile, the real Montgomery was in England, finalizing plans for the Normandy invasion. The Germans, convinced Montgomery was still in the Mediterranean, adjusted their invasion timeline accordingly. When D-Day came on June 6th, German intelligence initially dismissed it as a feint, partly because Montgomery couldn't possibly have returned to England in time to command it. George Patton, arguably America's most aggressive commander, was deliberately kept visible in southeastern England. German intelligence considered Patton the Allies' best general and assumed he would command the main invasion force. Throughout the spring of 1944, Patton made public appearances in southeastern England, attended social functions, and even delivered a controversial speech that made international news. Every Patton sighting was duly reported by German intelligence networks. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, tracked his movements with the obsessive attention usually reserved for enemy heads of state. If Patton was in southeastern England, commanding Fusag, German analysts reasoned, then the invasion must come at Calais. The deception extended to the highest levels of German intelligence penetration. Britain's double-cross system, managed by the 20 Committee, had achieved something unprecedented in intelligence history: complete control over German espionage in Britain. Every German agent operating in the United Kingdom was either captured, turned, or executed. The Germans didn't know it, but every piece of intelligence they received from Britain came from British-controlled sources. The deception continued for weeks after D-Day. Double agents reported that Fusag was preparing for an imminent assault. Radio traffic simulated final preparations. Dummy installations were photographed, showing increased activity. German intelligence, having committed to their assessment, interpreted every piece of evidence as confirming their conclusions. General Omar Bradley, commanding actual American ground forces in Normandy, later wrote, "The success of fortitude in keeping German reserves away from Normandy was worth more than 15 divisions. It was the difference between success and potential disaster." On June 17th, 11 days after D-Day, Rommel requested permission to move the 116th Panzer Division from Calais to Normandy. Hitler refused, citing intelligence that Fusag was preparing to attack within days. The division that might have stopped the American breakout from the beachhead remained at Calais, guarding against armies of rubber and canvas. By July 1944, German commanders in Normandy were desperate for reinforcements. The Allies had landed over 1 million men and were preparing for breakout operations. But Hitler, still convinced the main invasion was coming at Calais, refused to release the 15th Army. When Patton friendly appeared in France on July 28th, commanding the real Third Army in Normandy, German intelligence initially refused to believe it. How could Patton be in Normandy when Fusag was still preparing to attack Calais? The confusion persisted even as the Allies broke out of Normandy and swept across France. German intelligence continued reporting Fusag preparations through August 1944. Not until September, when Allied forces were approaching the German border, did the Wehrmacht finally realize that Fusag had never existed. The psychological impact on German command was devastating. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, later testified, "The deception was so perfect that we could not believe we had been deceived. Even after Normandy, we expected Patton's army to attack at Calais. By the time we realized the truth, France was lost." The statistics of Fortitude's success were staggering. On D-Day, approximately 50,000 German troops defended the Normandy beaches. Another 250,000 remained at Calais, frozen in place by phantom armies. For 7 weeks, these forces remained unavailable for the crucial battle in Normandy. When they were finally released, the opportunity to stop the invasion had passed. The human cost of German paralysis was equally stark. American forces suffered approximately 4,400 casualties on D-Day, far fewer than the 10,000 Eisenhower had expected. British and Canadian forces lost roughly 3,000 men. These casualties, while tragic, were a fraction of what might have occurred if the full German strength had been positioned at the landing beaches. The architects of fortitude achieved something unprecedented in military history. They had turned German intelligence services into unwitting accomplices in their own defeat. Every German agent in Britain, every reconnaissance flight, every radio intercept had been manipulated to reinforce the deception. The Germans hadn't simply been fed false information, they had been led to construct their own false reality. The technical sophistication of the deception was matched by its psychological insight. The British understood that successful deception required more than just creating false evidence. It required understanding how the enemy thought, what they expected to find, and how to make fiction more believable than reality. Colonel Bevan's London Controlling Section had studied German intelligence methods for years. They knew the Abwehr trusted human intelligence over technical collection. They knew German analysts tended to confirm their preconceptions rather than challenge them. They knew Hitler's intuition could override careful analysis. Every element of fortitude was designed to exploit these characteristics. The dummy equipment alone represented an extraordinary industrial effort. British factories produced over 200 inflatable Sherman tanks, 150 rubber landing craft, and countless vehicles, artillery pieces, and aircraft. Each piece was carefully designed to be photographically convincing while requiring minimal resources to produce. The entire dummy invasion fleet cost less than 2 genuine destroyers. The dummy installations include elaborate touches that suggested occupied bases. Workers created vehicle tracks around rubber tanks. Laundry lines appeared between tents. Service units maintained genuine kitchens and generators to create appropriate heat signatures. Some installations even had recorded sounds of tank engines played through loudspeakers when German reconnaissance flights approached. In Dover, British engineers constructed an entire fake oil supply depot, including storage tanks, pipelines, and pumping stations. The facility was designed to suggest the fuel capacity needed for a major invasion. German photo interpreters studied these images and calculated that the Allies were accumulating precisely the fuel stocks required for an assault on Calais. The radio deception represented perhaps the most sophisticated element of fortitude. Military communications follow strict patterns, reflecting organizational structure, operational tempo, and command relationships. Creating convincing traffic for fictional units required operators who understood these patterns intimately and could maintain them consistently over months. The radio operators were housed in facilities across southeastern England, transmitting according to carefully coordinated schedules. Each operator represented a specific unit within Fussek's fictional order of battle. They sent thousands of messages daily, coordinating imaginary training exercises, supply deliveries, and personal movements. The traffic volume and message content had to match what German signal intelligence would expect from genuine divisions preparing for combat. German signals intelligence units intercepted and analyzed this traffic obsessively. They identified individual radio operators by their distinctive transmission styles, tracked unit movements by changes in transmitter locations, and deduced operational plans from message frequency and content. Every analysis confirmed that massive forces were preparing for operations in southeastern England. The coordination required to maintain this deception was extraordinary. The 20 Committee met weekly to review every message from double agents, ensuring consistency across all channels. The London Controlling Section coordinated deception activities across multiple agencies and nations. Any inconsistency could have unraveled the entire operation. The success of Fortitude depended on the Germans never capturing an Allied soldier who knew the truth. Thousands of people had some knowledge of the deception: radio operators, construction crews, double agents, handlers, and intelligence officers. Each represented a potential security breach that could expose the operation. The fact that the secret was held for so long, across so many people, remains one of the remarkable security achievements of the war. The deception extended to diplomatic channels. Allied diplomats, aware that their communications were likely monitored, discussed invasion planning in ways that reinforced German assumptions. Neutral Swedish and Swiss officials, known to have contacts with German intelligence, received carefully calibrated information during social encounters. Even accidental security leaks were staged to provide confirming evidence. One of the most audacious elements involved using German intelligence's own agents against them. The British knew German intelligence operated networks of agents in neutral countries who monitored Allied activities. Rather than shut down these networks, British intelligence fed them information that supported Fortitude. German agents in Portugal and Spain reported seeing documents about Fusek preparations, never suspecting the documents had been deliberately exposed to them. The psychological warfare aspect was equally sophisticated. British intelligence studied German command personalities and tailored deception to exploit individual weaknesses. They knew Hitler trusted intuition over analysis, so they created evidence that would trigger his intuitive responses. They knew Rommel valued personal reconnaissance, so they ensured dummy installations would appear convincing from ground level. They knew German intelligence officers were promoted based on confirming their superiors' beliefs, so they provided evidence that rewarded analysts who reached the desired conclusions. The operation also exploited German racism and preconceptions about Allied capabilities. German intelligence assumed Americans were industrially powerful but strategically incompetent. The fictional Fusek reflected these assumptions, massive in size, equipped with overwhelming material, but positioned for an obvious and unimaginative assault on the nearest objective. German analysts saw what they expected to see. As the weeks after D-Day passed, maintaining the deception required increasingly elaborate efforts. Double agents had to explain why Fusek wasn't attacking despite perfect weather conditions. The explanation provided was that Eisenhower had changed the invasion plan after Normandy proved more successful than expected. Fusek would now follow up the Normandy breakout rather than launching a separate assault. This explanation was brilliantly designed. It acknowledged the reality of Normandy's success while maintaining that substantial forces remained uncommitted. German intelligence, desperate to make sense of contradictory information, seized on this narrative. It explained why Patton hadn't attacked, why massive forces remained visible in southeastern England, and why the Allies seemed content to fight in Normandy rather than opening a second front. Throughout July 1944, as American forces prepared for Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, Fortitude continued generating reports of Fusek preparations. The Germans, trying to track Allied units, created fantastical orders of battle that included both genuine divisions fighting in Normandy and fictional units supposedly waiting in England. German intelligence maps showed Allied forces nearly twice as large as their actual strength. The breaking point came in late July 1944 when Pétain finally appeared in Normandy, commanding the Third Army. German intelligence struggled to explain how Pétain could have moved from southeastern England to Normandy without detection. Some analysts suggested he had been replaced as Fusek commander. Others proposed that Fusek had been secretly moved to Normandy. None considered the obvious truth: Fusek had never existed. The 15th Army began moving toward Normandy in early August, 7 weeks after D-Day. By then, the Battle of Normandy was effectively over. American forces had broken out in Avranches and were racing toward Paris. The divisions that might have stopped the invasion in its first critical days arrived too late to affect the outcome. They would instead be caught in the Falaise pocket and decimated by Allied air power and artillery. The final irony of fortitude came in September 1944, when Allied forces actually approached Calais from the south, having swept through France after the Normandy breakout. The German defenders, who had spent 4 months preparing for invasion from the sea, found themselves attacked from behind by armies they didn't know existed. General von Salmuth, commander of the 15th Army that had waited at Calais, was captured in September 1944. During interrogation, he was shown evidence that Fusek had been fictional. His reaction, recorded by Allied intelligence officers, captured the psychological devastation of the deception. "You mean we were guarding against phantoms? 250,000 men, our best divisions, positioned against armies that existed only in radio transmissions? This is not warfare, this is sorcery." The post-war analysis of fortitude revealed its comprehensive impact. British intelligence estimated the deception had kept 19 divisions out of the Normandy battle for an average of 7 weeks. Using conservative calculations of combat effectiveness, this represented a military force equivalent to 10 to 15 additional Allied divisions. The Allies had landed 37 divisions in the first 2 months of the campaign. Fortitude had effectively increased this force by 30 to 40%. The human cost was equally significant. American military analysts estimated that casualty rates in the first month of Normandy would have been 200 to 300% higher if the full German strength had been committed to the beaches. The 7,000 Allied soldiers killed on D-Day and in the immediate follow-up might have been 15 to 20,000 without Fortitude's success. German generals captured after the war expressed amazement at the deception's sophistication. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, interrogated by American intelligence, stated, "We knew the Allies were masters of industrial production, but we did not understand they were equally masters of deception. They created armies from nothing, fabricated intelligence that we could not question, and manipulated our entire command structure. We were beaten before the first soldier landed, defeated by information that didn't exist." Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander in the West, was more succinct. "The invasion succeeded because we were defending against the wrong invasion in the wrong place. We prepared for the attack we expected rather than the attack they delivered. In modern war, this is fatal." The architects of fortitude received modest recognition after the war. Colonel Bevan was knighted, but never publicly acknowledged for his role. Lieutenant Colonel Strangeways returned to farming, his wartime activities classified for decades. The double agents who had risked execution if discovered were pensioned quietly, their contributions unrecognized until files were declassified in the 1970s. Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo, disappeared after the war. British intelligence faked his death by disease in Angola to protect him from German revenge. He lived quietly in Venezuela until researchers tracked him down in the 1980s. In 1984, He returned to London, where the Duke of Edinburgh personally thanked him for his service. Pujol died in 1988, one of the few intelligence officers whose work provably changed the course of history. The technical innovations of Fortitude influenced intelligence operations for decades. The concept of comprehensive deception, involving multiple intelligence channels reinforcing a consistent narrative, became standard practice. The methods of radio deception, developed for FUSEG, informed Cold War intelligence operations. The double-agent management techniques pioneered by the 20 Committee became foundational texts for intelligence services worldwide. The dummy equipment technology developed for Fortitude found post-war applications. Inflatable tanks and vehicles became standard deception equipment for military forces globally. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces maintained inventories of dummy equipment based on British designs from 1944. Modern military deception still employs many of the same principles, updated with digital technology, but fundamentally unchanged from Fortitude's methods. The psychological insights from Fortitude proved equally enduring. The understanding that deception succeeds by confirming enemy preconceptions rather than forcing new beliefs became a cornerstone of deception theory. Military intelligence officers study Fortitude not for its specific techniques, which have been superseded by technology, but for its psychological sophistication and comprehensive approach. Perhaps most significantly, Fortitude demonstrated that information could be weaponized as effectively as explosives. The phantom armies of FUSEG destroyed more German combat effectiveness than months of aerial bombardment. The radio transmissions from fictional headquarters paralyzed German decision-making more completely than any jamming operation. The double agents' reports tied down divisions more effectively than any minefield. The operation also revealed uncomfortable truths about intelligence analysis. German intelligence officers were not stupid or incompetent. They were professionals who analyzed evidence systematically using established methodologies. They were defeated by an adversary who understood their methodologies better than they did themselves, who could feed their analytical processes with carefully calibrated false information that confirmed their command's strategic assumptions. The lesson resonated through subsequent conflicts. During the Cold War, intelligence services on both sides spent enormous resources trying to avoid being deceived as thoroughly as German intelligence had been in 1944. The fear of another Fortitude haunted intelligence analysis, sometimes causing analysts to dismiss genuine intelligence as potential deception. The human dimension of Fortitude often gets lost in discussions of its technical sophistication. Behind the radio transmissions and dummy tanks were thousands of individuals maintaining an elaborate fiction while knowing that failure could cost tens of thousands of lives. Radio operators transmitted messages for fictional units, knowing that any mistake might alert German analysts. Double agents met their German handlers, knowing that discovery meant torture and execution. Intelligence officers reviewed every message, knowing that an inconsistency could unravel months of work. The psychological pressure was enormous. Double agents like Garbo had to maintain complex fictional networks while ensuring every detail remained consistent with previous reports. A single contradiction could have exposed them. They operated knowing the Germans were analyzing every message for signs of deception, looking for precisely the inconsistencies that could reveal the truth. The construction workers building dummy installations worked under constant German reconnaissance. They knew the Luftwaffe aircraft photographed their work regularly. Any mistake in positioning or construction that looked unnatural from an aerial perspective could have revealed the deception. They built installations designed to deceive photo interpreters who were specifically trained to identify fakes. the radio operators faced perhaps the most demanding task. Military communications have distinctive characteristics that experienced signals intelligence analysts can identify. German operators tracked individual Allied radio operators by their unique transmission styles, called fists. The FUSAG radio operators had to create and maintain consistent transmission personalities for fictional operators, while ensuring the traffic patterns matched genuine military units. The 20 committee members who coordinated double agents carried the weight of knowing that their decisions could determine the invasion's success. They met weekly to review every proposed message, analyzing how German intelligence might interpret each piece of information. A single poorly conceived message could have exposed the entire operation. The stress led to what contemporary documents describe as a near breakdown among key personnel. Colonel Bevan was hospitalized for exhaustion in May 1944. Several double agents developed severe anxiety symptoms. Radio operators worked 18-hour shifts maintaining FUSAG traffic. The psychological cost of maintaining the deception for 18 months was nearly as high as the military operations it supported. The ethical dimensions of fortitude were never officially examined, but they troubled some participants. The deception involved lying to people who would die because of those lies. German soldiers positioned at Calais based on false intelligence would later be killed when the real invasion landed elsewhere. Some British officers questioned whether this level of systematic deception was morally acceptable, even in warfare. The debate was never resolved, overtaken by military necessity. In the total war against Nazi Germany, few questioned the methods that saved Allied lives and shortened the conflict. The ethical concerns were noted in private diaries and post-war interviews, but never seriously challenged the operation's execution. The archives declassified decades after the war revealed that fortitude was even more comprehensive than initially understood. Recent research has uncovered deception operations that supported fortitude but were never officially acknowledged. These included manipulating German agents in neutral countries, using diplomatic channels to leak false information, and even staging apparent security breaches that revealed carefully prepared false documents. One particularly audacious element involved British intelligence discovering that the Germans had penetrated Allied diplomatic codes in Stockholm. Rather than change the codes, the British deliberately used them to transmit false information about FUSAG preparations. German codebreakers intercepted messages they believed were secure Allied communications, never suspecting the British knew the codes were compromised and were exploiting them for deception. The operation also involved timing genuine military activities to reinforce the deception. When real troop movements occurred, they were publicized in ways that suggested they were part of FUSAG preparations. Actual military exercises were conducted in locations where German reconnaissance could observe them, with results interpreted as FUSAG training. The line between reality and deception was deliberately blurred. The Germans themselves contributed to their deception through confirmation bias. Once German intelligence had concluded FUSAG was preparing to attack Calais, every new piece of information was interpreted to confirm this assessment. Evidence that contradicted the consensus was dismissed as false or misinterpreted. The intelligence officers who might have questioned the narrative were promoted away or overruled by superiors committed to the Calais theory. This phenomenon, where analysts become so invested in a conclusion that they unconsciously filter evidence to support it, was recognized after the war as a fundamental intelligence failure. Modern intelligence training specifically addresses this bias, using fortitude as a case study in how confirmation bias can be exploited by adversaries. The mathematical improbability of Fortitude's success is striking. The operation required coordinating hundreds of separate deception activities across 18 months, any one of which could have exposed the entire scheme. The fact that the Germans never detected a single major inconsistency, despite analyzing thousands of intelligence reports, represents either extraordinary British competence or remarkable German incompetence, most likely both. German intelligence files captured after the war show analysts occasionally noted inconsistencies in the intelligence about Fusag. These reports were typically dismissed by senior officers who were convinced of the Calais scenario. In several cases, analysts who questioned the consensus were removed from positions where they could influence assessment. The German intelligence bureaucracy effectively censored its own doubts. The operation's success also depended on factors beyond British control. If the Germans had captured an Allied officer with knowledge of the deception, if a double agent had been arrested and interrogated successfully, if German reconnaissance had discovered dummy installations at vulnerable moments during construction, any of these accidents could have exposed Fortitude. The operation survived partly through skill, but also through considerable luck. The invasion itself almost unraveled the deception. On D-Day morning, German commanders observing the Normandy landings faced a choice: commit reserves immediately to the obvious threat, or maintain position waiting for the real invasion at Calais. The decision was made not by military logic, but by Garbo's carefully timed message confirming that Normandy was a diversion. The message was so effective that Hitler personally commended Garbo's intelligence network, never knowing he was praising British intelligence for deceiving him. The commendation was intercepted by British codebreakers, confirming that the deception had worked. Intelligence officers reading Hitler's praise for the fictional agent realized they had achieved something unprecedented. They had made the enemy compliment them for his own deception. The weeks following D-Day saw Fortitude operating under maximum pressure. As Allied forces expanded the Normandy beachhead, German commanders repeatedly requested permission to move the 15th Army south. Each request was denied based on intelligence provided by British-controlled agents that Fusag was preparing for imminent assault. The double agents had to explain why Fusag continued preparing without attacking. The narrative they provided was intricate. Eisenhower had been surprised by Normandy's success and was now revising invasion plans. Fusag would be committed as an exploitation force after the Normandy breakout rather than launching a separate assault. This explained the delay while maintaining the threat. German intelligence accepted this explanation because it made strategic sense. Why launch a second invasion when the first was succeeding? The Allies would naturally exploit success rather than executing rigid pre-planned operations. The explanation fit German assumptions about Allied command flexibility and Eisenhower's pragmatic approach. Throughout July, as American forces prepared for Operation Cobra, the massive breakout assault, Fortitude maintained reports of Fusag activity. Double agents described increased training intensity, supply accumulation, and command meetings. German photo reconnaissance confirmed expanding dummy installations. Radio traffic showed heightened activity consistent with forces preparing for combat. The psychological impact on German commanders was devastating. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Kluge, who commanded German forces in Normandy, later wrote, "We were fighting a battle we could not win because our best forces were positioned against an enemy who didn't exist. Every request for reinforcements was denied because those forces were needed to counter the real invasion. We were being destroyed by phantoms." The breaking point for German intelligence came in late July and early August. By then, obvious discrepancies were emerging in the intelligence picture. Units supposedly in southeastern England were being identified in Normandy. Radio traffic patterns were changing in ways inconsistent with the established narrative. The overwhelming success of Operation Cobra suggested the Allies had committed forces supposedly held in reserve. German intelligence officers began questioning the assessment. Reports from this period, discovered in captured files, show increasing skepticism about FUSAG. Several analysts proposed that the entire intelligence picture might be a deception. These reports were suppressed by senior officers unwilling to admit they had been deceived for 4 months. The institutional resistance to acknowledging deception is a recurring theme in intelligence failure. Organizations invest enormous resources in collection and analysis. Admitting that the entire intelligence picture has been manipulated requires acknowledging systemic failure. Senior officers with careers built on their analytical acumen are psychologically resistant to such conclusions. In the German case, this resistance persisted even as evidence mounted. Not until mid-August, when Allied forces were sweeping across France and Patton's Third Army was clearly operating in Normandy, did the German High Command officially acknowledge that FUSAG had been deceived. Even then, some intelligence officers insisted the deception was partial, that some forces in southeastern England were real even if FUSAG itself was fictional. The psychological devastation of this realization cannot be overstated. German intelligence had committed its reputation, its analysis, and its command's decision-making to an assessment that proved completely false. The 15th Army had waited for 2 months, guarding against invasion forces that existed only in imagination. The best German divisions had been held out of the crucial battle based on radio transmissions from non-existent headquarters. General von Salmuth, whose 15th Army had been the primary victim of fortitude, was captured during the retreat from France. His interrogation revealed a man shattered by the recognition of how thoroughly he had been deceived. Interrogation transcripts show him struggling to understand how such comprehensive deception had been possible. We had agent reports, radio intercepts, photo reconnaissance, captured documents. Every source confirmed the same picture. How can all sources be false? The answer, which Allied intelligence officers couldn't fully reveal during interrogation, was that British intelligence had achieved something unique: total control over German intelligence collection in the United Kingdom. Every human source was controlled, every radio transmission was designed to deceive, and every photo opportunity was staged. The Germans hadn't failed to collect intelligence, they had been fed a comprehensive false reality. The long-term impact on German intelligence operations was severe. After Fortitude, German intelligence officers approached all Allied intelligence with suspicion bordering on paranoia. Reports of Allied activities were dismissed as potential deception even when genuine. This overcorrection hampered German intelligence for the remainder of the war, making it nearly impossible to assess Allied intentions with confidence. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated this impact. German intelligence successfully concealed its own offensive preparations, but its assessment of Allied strength and dispositions was wildly inaccurate. German commanders, scarred by the Fortitude experience, assumed Allied weaknesses were deception and Allied strengths were exaggerated. They attacked into what they believed was a lightly defended sector, only to discover American forces were stronger than assessed. Fortitude had taught German intelligence to distrust everything, rendering them nearly as ineffective as when they trusted false intelligence. The lesson was harsh. Intelligence organizations that lose confidence in their ability to distinguish truth from deception become paralyzed, unable to provide commanders with accessible assessments of enemy capabilities and intentions. The human toll of fortitude extended beyond the battlefield. German soldiers stationed at Calais spent months preparing for an invasion that never came, living under the constant stress of anticipated assault. Many developed psychological problems from a prolonged high-alert status. Medical reports from 15th Army units show increasing rates of anxiety disorders, psychosomatic illness, and stress-related conditions through summer 1944. These men were eventually committed to combat during the retreat from France, but months of static defensive duty had degraded their combat effectiveness. Units that might have been decisive in Normandy's crucial early days were instead worn down by inactivity before being thrown into hopeless defensive battles across France. Many of these soldiers became casualties not because of combat prowess, but because of poor timing. They were committed when defeat was already inevitable. The families of German soldiers killed or captured in France after being held at Calais had no way of knowing their loved ones had been victims of deception. They believed, as German propaganda claimed, that the Wehrmacht had been overwhelmed by superior numbers and material. The truth that German forces had been positioned based on false intelligence and committed to battle too late to affect the outcome remained classified for decades. The broader strategic impact of fortitude extended beyond the Normandy campaign. The success of the deception convinced Allied planners that similar operations could work elsewhere. Deception plans were developed for subsequent operations, including Operation Market Garden and the Rhine crossings. While none achieved fortitude's comprehensive success, the techniques refined in 1944 became standard practice. The Soviets, informed about fortitude through intelligence sharing, adopted similar methods for their 1944-1945 offensives. Soviet deception operations, called Maskirovka, employed dummy installations, false radio traffic, and disinformation to disguise attack locations. These operations, while less sophisticated than fortitude, proved highly effective against German forces already conditioned to expect deception. The psychological warfare aspect of fortitude had implications beyond tactical deception. German commanders, who learned they had been deceived, experienced a loss of confidence in their own judgment. This psychological impact degraded German decision-making for the remainder of the war. Commanders who had been victims of fortitude became hesitant, second-guessing obvious conclusions, and suspecting deception even in straightforward situations. This erosion of confidence manifested in command decisions throughout late 1944 and early 1945. German commanders delayed responses to genuine Allied offensives, suspecting diversionary attacks. They held reserves waiting for real attacks that were already underway. The Battle of the Bulge, the Remagen Bridge crossing, and various Rhine operations all benefited from German command hesitation, rooted partly in fortitude's legacy. The monetary cost of fortitude was remarkably modest compared to its impact. British estimates suggest the entire operation cost approximately £10 million in 1944 pounds, equivalent to perhaps £500 million today. This included construction of dummy installations, maintenance of double-agent networks, radio equipment, and personnel costs. The cost represented roughly the equivalent of building 2 battleships, a trivial expense compared to its strategic value. By contrast, the German defensive preparations at Calais cost hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks. The 15th Army consumed enormous resources in ammunition, fuel, and supplies while waiting for an attack that never came. The Atlantic Wall fortifications at Calais, among the most heavily reinforced sections of the entire defensive system, represented a massive construction effort that contributed nothing to defending Normandy. The industrial resources allocated to defending Calais represented an opportunity cost that Germany could not afford. Steel used in beach obstacles at Calais could have built tanks for Normandy. Concrete poured into bunkers overlooking empty seas could have reinforced genuine defensive positions. Artillery pieces facing the English Channel across the narrowest crossing point sat silent while the battle raged 200 miles away. The human resources were equally wasted. The 250,000 soldiers of 15th Army included significant numbers of experienced combat veterans, particularly in the armored divisions. These men spent the summer of 1944 conducting training exercises and improving fortifications, while their comrades in Normandy were being destroyed. When they were finally committed to combat, they were thrown into battles already lost, their combat power expended in rearguard actions rather than decisive counterattacks. The intelligence resources devoted to tracking Fusog represented another significant waste. German photo interpreters spent thousands of hours analyzing images of dummy installations. Signals intelligence units dedicated substantial collection assets to intercepting Fusog radio traffic. Espionage networks focused on reporting Fusog activities, while real Allied preparations received less attention. The German intelligence system was effectively paralyzed by chasing phantoms. The broader diplomatic impact extended beyond purely military considerations. Neutral countries observing Allied deception capabilities concluded Anglo-American sophistication and competence. Sweden and Switzerland, both of which had German intelligence networks operating on their territory, were impressed by the Allied ability to manipulate information. This influenced their diplomatic positioning and willingness to cooperate with Allied requests. Spain, officially neutral but sympathetic to Germany, had an extensive German intelligence presence. The success of Fortitude demonstrated to Spanish authorities that Germany was losing the intelligence war as decisively as the military war. This contributed to Spain's gradual shift toward Allied alignment in late 1944 and 1945, including restricting German intelligence operations and expanding cooperation with Allied intelligence services. The Turkish government, critically positioned between Europe and the Middle East, was similarly influenced. Turkey had maintained neutrality while allowing both Allied and Axis intelligence operations. Fortitude's success, widely known in intelligence circles by late 1944, demonstrated Allied superiority in intelligence operations. This contributed to Turkey's decision to sever relations with Germany in August 1944 and declare war in February 1945. The post-war intelligence community studied Fortitude obsessively. The operation became a required case study in intelligence schools worldwide. CIA officers, KGB analysts, MI6 agents, all studied how British intelligence had achieved total control over German intelligence collection and exploited that control for strategic advantage. The techniques became foundational to Cold War intelligence operations. The specific methods of Fortitude were adapted for the Cold War context. Double-agent operations, pioneered on a large scale by the 20 Committee, became standard counterintelligence practice. Radio deception techniques, refined in creating FUSAG traffic, informed electronic warfare development. The psychological insights about exploiting enemy preconceptions influenced decades of deception planning. The dummy equipment technology found extensive Cold War applications. NATO forces maintained inventories of inflatable tanks, vehicles, and aircraft for deception operations. Soviet forces developed similar capabilities, creating entire dummy military installations visible to Western reconnaissance satellites. The descendants of the canvas and rubber creations used to deceive German photo interpreters evolved into sophisticated inflatable systems designed to fool infrared sensors and radar. The human intelligence aspects, particularly double agent management, became perhaps the most influential legacy. The 20 Committee's systematic approach to controlling enemy agents and using them for deception became the model for counterintelligence services globally. The techniques for building agent credibility, maintaining cover stories, and coordinating information across multiple sources were studied and refined throughout the Cold War. The ethical dimensions of comprehensive deception emerged as a topic for intelligence philosophy. Fortitude demonstrated that systematic deception could be weaponized at a strategic scale, raising questions about the boundaries of acceptable intelligence practice. These questions became more urgent as Cold War operations involved peacetime deception against adversaries who were not actively at war. The debate centered on whether deception that caused deaths, even enemy deaths, could be justified outside combat situations. Fortitude had been conducted during total war against Nazi Germany, where such questions were overshadowed by military necessity. Cold War operations occurred in ambiguous situations where the moral calculus was less clear. Intelligence services struggled with defining acceptable boundaries for deception operations. The impact on German survivors haunted many participants on both sides. Allied intelligence officers who had crafted the deception sometimes expressed discomfort about the German soldiers who died because they had been positioned based on false intelligence. While recognizing the military necessity, some struggled with having caused deaths through systematic lying rather than direct combat. German survivors of Fortitude expressed complex emotions ranging from bitter resentment to grudging admiration. Some viewed the deception as dishonorable, a violation of warrior ethics where victory should be achieved through superior combat performance rather than trickery. Others recognized it as a brilliant application of intelligence capabilities, regretting that Germany had lacked equivalent sophistication. Oberst von Frundsberg, who had commanded coastal defenses at Calais, lived until 1978. In late-life interviews, he expressed mixed feelings about his experience. "We waited for 4 months, certain the invasion would come to our sector. My men were prepared, alert, and confident. When we finally moved to Normandy, the battle was already lost. I sometimes wonder if we had been there from the beginning, could we have stopped the invasion? But then I realized this is exactly what the British wanted us to think. Even now, I cannot escape their deception." The reconnaissance pilots who had photographed dummy installations discovered post-war that they had been documenting fiction. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot who flew dozens of missions over southeastern England, later wrote, "I photographed those invasion preparations carefully, knowing that commanders' decisions would be based on my work. I counted ships, identified units, and noted changes. Every photograph showed exactly what the British wanted us to see. My best efforts contributed to our defeat. The British didn't shoot me down, they used me." The radio operators who had intercepted FUSAG traffic had similar experiences. Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt, a signals intelligence operator who spent months tracking FUSAG communications, recalled, "I became familiar with individual enemy radio operators by their transmission characteristics. I could identify specific operators, track unit movements, and predict activity levels. I wrote reports used for intelligence assessments. Everything I reported was false, but I never suspected. The transmissions were perfect, better than perfect actually, because they matched our theoretical expectations exactly. They told us what we wanted to hear." The photo interpreters who analyzed thousands of reconnaissance images of southeastern England discovered post-war that their entire body of work had been analyzing staged deceptions. These highly trained specialists who could identify specific vehicle types from aerial photography and assess force concentrations with mathematical precision had been completely fooled. Their professional confidence never fully recovered. The German intelligence officers who had assessed FUSAG as genuine experienced perhaps the most severe psychological impact. Their careers had been built on analytical ability and judgment. Discovering that their most important assessment had been completely wrong, that they had been systematically deceived for months, shattered their professional self-conception. Several suffered psychological problems requiring treatment. Major Friedrich Wilhelm von Bohnen, a German intelligence officer responsible for assessing Allied intentions, was captured in 1945 and interrogated extensively. His reactions, documented in declassified files, showed a man struggling to understand how he had been so thoroughly deceived. "I am a trained intelligence officer. I know methods of deception, techniques of disinformation. I analyzed the intelligence critically, looking for inconsistencies. I found none. How is this possible? Either I am incompetent or the British achieved something unprecedented. I must believe the latter." The archives of German intelligence assessments from 1944, captured intact by Allied forces, revealed the comprehensiveness of the deception's success. These documents show sophisticated analysis, careful reasoning, and systematic evaluation of evidence. The methodology was sound, the tradecraft was professional, yet the conclusions were entirely false because every source had been compromised or manipulated. Modern intelligence analysts studying these files see a cautionary tale. Good methodology applied to corrupted information produces confident, wrong answers. The Germans weren't foolish or incompetent. They were defeated by an adversary who controlled their information environment completely. This remains perhaps the most concerning lesson of fortitude. Competent professional intelligence analysis can be defeated by comprehensive deception at the source. The technical analysis of how fortitude succeeded continues to evolve as more documents are declassified. Recent scholarship has revealed additional layers of deception not previously understood. The operation was even more comprehensive than wartime participants realized, involving dimensions of psychological warfare, diplomatic manipulation, and technical innovation that remained classified for decades. One particularly sophisticated element involved British intelligence exploiting German confidence in their own code-breaking abilities. The Germans knew they had broken some Allied codes and assumed their intelligence from these sources was reliable. British intelligence discovered these compromises and deliberately used the broken codes to transmit false information, knowing German codebreakers would intercept messages they believed were secure Allied communications. This created a particularly insidious form of deception. German intelligence trusted intercepts from codes they had broken more than agent reports, reasoning that coded messages reflected genuine Allied communications rather than intended deceptions. By feeding false information through compromised codes, British intelligence ensured their deceptions reached German analysis through the most trusted channel. The operation also involved manipulating German agents who had successfully remained undetected by British counterintelligence. These agents, believing themselves secure, were observed by British surveillance and fed information through controlled circumstances. They reported what they genuinely believed to be intelligence discovered through skillful espionage, never realizing British intelligence had arranged for them to discover precisely what Fortitude wanted reported. This created layers of deception, where German intelligence received confirming reports from multiple sources they considered independent. In reality, all sources were feeding variations of the same British prepared narrative. The confirmation created confidence that made the deception nearly impossible to question. When every source tells the same story, intelligence organizations conclude the story must be true. The mathematical precision of the deception was extraordinary. British intelligence calculated how many dummy tanks German photo interpreters would expect to see for an invasion force of a specified size. They positioned precisely that number. They calculated radio traffic volume for fictional divisions and generated exactly that amount. They determined what ammunition stockpiles would be visible for an invasion force and constructed dummy installations showing appropriate quantities. This precision meant German analysts performing calculations on Allied capabilities reached conclusions that the British had predetermined. When German planners calculated whether observed forces were sufficient for invasion, their mathematics confirmed exactly what Fortitude intended. The Germans were doing genuine analysis on false data, reaching conclusions that seemed mathematically validated but were actually predetermined by deceptive design. The psychological sophistication extended to understanding individual German commanders. British intelligence maintained detailed personality profiles of senior German officers, analyzing their decision-making patterns, intellectual biases, and command styles. Fortitude was designed to exploit specific weaknesses in specific commanders who would make key decisions. Hitler's tendencies toward intuitive decision-making and distrust of conventional military analysis were exploited by creating situations where his intuition would lead to wrong conclusions. Rommel's preference for personal reconnaissance was addressed by ensuring dummy installations would appear convincing at ground level. Von Rundstedt's methodical, analytical approach was defeated by providing perfectly consistent evidence across all sources. The operation succeeded partly because it was designed not as one deception, but as dozens of interlocking deceptions, each targeting specific aspects of German intelligence collection and analysis. Photo reconnaissance was defeated by dummy installations. Signals intelligence was defeated by controlled radio traffic. Human intelligence was defeated by controlled agents. Code breaking was defeated by controlled communications. Every collection method yielded information supporting the same false narrative. The comprehensiveness meant Germans could not defeat the deception by improving any single collection capability. Better photo reconnaissance revealed more detailed images of dummy installations. More sophisticated signals intelligence intercepted more elaborate false traffic. Additional espionage resources were directed toward controlled agents who provided more detailed false reports. Every increase in German collection capability was met by expanded British deception. This created a uniquely frustrating situation where German intelligence was defeated by its own competence. Better intelligence collection yielded more confirming evidence of falsehood. More sophisticated analysis created more confidence in wrong conclusions. Increased resources devoted to understanding Allied intentions generated a more comprehensive misunderstanding. The Germans were trapped in a system where improvement made things worse. The long-term historical assessment of Fortitude has evolved as understanding of its scope has expanded. Initial post-war accounts treated it as clever tactical deception. Later analysis recognized its strategic significance. Recent scholarship has elevated it to perhaps the most successful intelligence operation in military history, affecting strategic outcomes more decisively than any comparable effort. The operation's influence extended beyond World War II to shape modern intelligence theory and practice. Fortitude demonstrated that information warfare could achieve strategic effects previously possible only through military force. It proved that perception management could tie down enemy forces more effectively than direct combat. It showed that controlling an enemy's information environment could be a decisive advantage in modern war. These lessons informed Cold War strategy, where direct military confrontation was constrained by nuclear weapons. If battlefield victory was too dangerous, victory through information manipulation became an attractive alternative. Intelligence services on both sides spent enormous resources trying to achieve advantages comparable to Fortitude, while defending against similar deceptions directed against themselves. The ultimate irony of Fortitude was that its success made similar operations harder to execute. German survivors ensured their experience became institutional memory for Cold War intelligence services. Soviet intelligence, learning from German mistakes, implemented multiple safeguards against comprehensive deception. Western intelligence, fearing Soviet equivalents of Fortitude, developed complex verification methodologies to detect deception. This created an intelligence environment where both sides spent enormous resources defending against deceptions that might never come, while simultaneously attempting deceptions that were increasingly difficult to execute. Fortitude's legacy was a world where intelligence services were simultaneously more capable of deception and more paranoid about being deceived. In the final analysis, Fortitude South kept 19 German divisions out of the Battle of Normandy for 7 critical weeks. These 250,000 soldiers, positioned against phantom armies to defend against non-existent invasion, represented more combat power than those defending the actual landing beaches. Their absence allowed the Allies to establish the beachhead that became the staging area for liberating Western Europe. The human cost was measured in lives saved and lives lost. Allied casualties in Normandy were far lower than predicted, partly because German strength was divided, waiting for invasions that never came. German casualties were correspondingly higher, partly because their forces were committed piecemeal, without decisive armored reserves held at Calais. The broader strategic impact cannot be precisely calculated, but was certainly enormous. Had the 15th Army been committed to Normandy from D-Day, the invasion might have failed. At a minimum, the breakout from the beachhead would have been delayed by weeks or months. The war might have extended into 1946, with incalculable additional casualties and different geopolitical outcomes. These alternative histories remain speculation, but the reality is clear. Fortitude achieved strategic effects through information manipulation that military operations could not have accomplished. It tied down enemy forces without firing a shot. It paralyzed enemy command without jamming communications. It defeated enemy intelligence without breaking codes. It won battles without combat. The operation stands as a testament to the power of comprehensive deception in modern warfare. In an age of total war, where victory requires mobilizing entire societies and economies, controlling enemy perception of reality becomes as important as controlling physical territory. Fortitude demonstrated that armies can be defeated by phantoms, that confidence can be more dangerous than confusion, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that doesn't exist. The dummy tanks and inflatable landing craft have long since deflated and disappeared. The radio transmitters that broadcast FUSAG's phantom communications are silent relics in museums. The double agents who risked everything have passed into history. But the lessons of fortitude endure. That information is power, that perception shapes reality, and that in warfare, sometimes the greatest victories are won not through superior force, but through superior deception. The Germans had prepared for the invasion they expected. The Allies delivered the invasion they didn't. Between expectation and reality lay 200 miles of French coast, 7 weeks of crucial time, and 250,000 German soldiers guarding against armies that existed only in radio transmissions and intelligence reports. That gap between perception and reality decided the fate of Western Europe. Oberst von Frundsberg had stood in his bunker at Calais, confident the invasion would come to his sector, his binoculars trained on waters that would never see an invasion fleet. He had been right about everything, except the one thing that mattered, where the enemy would attack. British intelligence had ensured that his certainty would become Germany's catastrophe. The invasion came where they weren't looking, against defenses that weren't ready, with consequences that changed history. In the end, Hitler wasted his best troops not through poor military judgment, but through brilliant Allied deception. The phantom armies of fortitude achieved what real armies might not have. They made the Germans defeat themselves through their own intelligence, their own analysis, and their own reasonable conclusions drawn from comprehensively false information. It was not warfare. It was, as General von Selmwitz said, sorcery. But it was sorcery based on scientific understanding of intelligence methods, psychological insight into human decision-making, and meticulous execution across 18 months of relentless deception. The British trick wasn't crazy, it was genius, and it helped win World War II.